I'm Betsy Jacks. I'm director of the Thomas Cole National Historic Site, and I'm welcoming you here on this special occasion. I'd like to make sure that everyone knows that after this talk, we're having a reception and a viewing of the exhibition at the Thomas Cole House. So be sure to get in your cars and come on over there. And I'd like to thank a few people that made this whole amazing program and exhibition possible. Of course, John Wilmerding, who was our guest curator this year, and Kate Mencanary, who is our assistant curator on the exhibition, just did an amazing job. The lenders to this show, we gave them 6 months. We said, we need your painting now, and they all said yes. Really so generous, lending their paintings. And the people who sponsored the show really came forward. They said, this is an important show. We want to make it happen. The Wyeth Foundation, Eli Wilner and Company, the Bay and Paul Foundations, the Bank of Greene County, the Greene County Council on the Arts, and the Hudson River Valley National Heritage Area all came through for us. Thank you so much. I want to remind everyone to turn off their cell phones, and also to note that we have this beautiful catalog that we have a few left here, but if we run out, we'll have more at the Cole House, so do come over there. So now I get to introduce the man famous for his introductions. He is on our Board of Trustees. Please welcome David Barnes.
Thank you for being here on this glorious day to celebrate our 11th annual exhibition. We hope our first decade of shows at the Cole House has led you to expect firsts. Over just the last few years, you've seen the first exhibition to focus solely on the women artists of 19th century American landscape painting, the first East Coast exhibition of the work of African American landscape painter Robert Duncanson, and last year's exhibition, the first to focus solely on Albert Bierstadt's paintings of the northeastern United States. This year, we celebrate the 170th anniversary of what is arguably the most significant event to occur at the Cole House in its 200-year history, the 2-year apprenticeship of teenager Frederic Church with Thomas Cole from 1844 to 1846. Few art movements have ever seen so literal a passing of the torch, and never before has this critical moment in American art history been explored in an exhibition until now. So, who do you find to curate an exhibition of these two giants of 19th century American art? Another giant, of course. John Wilmerding is the Seraphim Professor of American Art Emeritus at Princeton University. He has also been a visiting curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and served as senior curator and deputy director of the National Gallery of Art in Washington, where he was former chairman of the Board of Trustees. He's currently a trustee of the Guggenheim Museum, Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, and the Wyeth Foundation for American Art, and was also appointed by President Obama to the Committee for the Preservation of the White House. But the question to ask about today's speaker is not, how did he come to be interested in American art, but rather, how could he possibly have avoided it? His great-grandparents were the Havermeyers, whose extraordinary collection of Old Master and Impressionist pictures became one of the largest gifts ever bequeathed to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Grandmother Electra Havermeyer Webb acquired a remarkably eclectic collection of American fine art, folk art, and other objects so vast that they started a museum around it, the Shelburne Museum in Vermont. So we shouldn't be surprised that John Wilmerding would choose to study art history at Harvard, earning his PhD in 1965. But, like all giants, today's speaker is greater than the sum of his accomplishments. For one, lots of people received PhDs in art history from Harvard in the 1960s, but almost none did their dissertation on American art, in no small part because they were strongly urged not to. And don't think John Wilmerding took lots of American art classes at Harvard, because he didn't and couldn't. There was only one course in American art history at Harvard in the 1960s, and it was taught, wait for it, once every 5 years. Nor do Mr. Wilmerding's other accomplishments, impressive as they are, always tell the full story. Yes, he did serve, as I mentioned, as senior curator of American art at the National Gallery. But John Wilmerding wasn't just a curator of American art there. He was the first. The National Gallery had no department of American art prior to his appointment. Indeed, when it was founded in 1941, the National Gallery had fewer than a dozen American paintings. It now has over 1,000, and it was today's speaker who helped create the field, establish the collection, and set the course, as he has done with so much of American art. His pioneering monographs and groundbreaking exhibitions on artists like Fitzhenry Lane, John Frederic Peto, Winslow Homer, and Thomas Eakins were the first to introduce names that we take for granted today. More recently, Mr. Wilmerding continues to write books on contemporary artists like Richard Estes, Robert Indiana, Tom Wesselman, and Roy Lichtenstein. But one reason Mr. Wilmerding is in such demand is because he can look at art and artists not only with the eye of a scholar, a teacher, and a curator, but also with the eye of a collector. True to his family heritage, Mr. Wilmerding caught the collecting bug. Making his first purchase in 1960, he created over the next 40 years one of the most impressive private art collections in the country. He has promised that collection to the National Gallery and has also left a major legacy of over 50 works of pop art to the Princeton University Art Museum. Finally, I couldn't introduce Mr. Wilmerding without mentioning something significant he shares with Thomas Cole and Frederic Church. If you saw last year's stunning exhibition by Mr. Wilmerding at Olana, entitled Maine Sublime, then you're familiar with his love for the Maine coast, and Mount Desert in particular, where Cole and Church also roamed. But for all his love of Maine, it was right here in Cole and Church country where, in 1965, Mr. Wilmerding experienced what he calls one of the key incidents in forming his identity as a scholar and a collector. Quote, "I heard from David Huntington about this all but unknown artist, Frederic Church. David was busy organizing support to save Olana, Church's wonderful estate on the Hudson River. We all went to see it, and it was one of those watershed moments that makes you understand the importance of preserving the past. The campaign to save Olana was the beginning, really, of a group of cohorts who loved American art. We worked together to encourage respect for the field. Our books began to come out, and there was this sense that we were claiming, or perhaps reclaiming is a better word, a place for American art. So that makes it easy for me to ask all of you who love American art, who love Frederic Church and Thomas Cole, and who are committed to preserving their homes and legacies, to please give a warm welcome to a true pioneer and kindred spirit, a giant, John Wilmerding."
Well, thank you. That's exhausting. Thank you very, very much. I guess the older I get, these introductions get nicer and nicer. I feel like they're better than obituaries. But anyway, it's a delight and a pleasure to be back here again. This little exhibition, which if you haven't already seen, I hope you will. There was a reception afterwards over at the Cole House, and let's all try and fit in together at once. It turned out to be a moment of, as David has said, of examining a 2-year period in the extraordinary lives of these two important artists, Thomas Cole, Frederic Church. And I realize I'm speaking to the converted here, and many of you know these details, but just to recap some of the basic information. Cole, born in 1801, dies a very young man, really, in mid-career, although we now think of it as a late career, in 1848, so in his 40s. Church, by contrast, had a much longer life. 1826, born in Hartford, doesn't die till 1900. Paints long after the work that they'd been doing, both artists, had gone out of favor. Dies not quite in obscurity, but largely unable to paint with severe arthritis in his later years, but of course also devoting his attention to the building of Olana. They come together for this really fascinating 2-year period, this beginning in the early summer of 1844, when, thanks to Church's father in Hartford, approached Daniel Wadsworth, the great collector and founder, of course, of the Wadsworth Athenaeum, who had already acquired works by Thomas Cole. If Mr. Cole, if Wadsworth would ask Mr. Cole if he might not take on the Church son, who was already beginning to show certain interest in art and certain bit of talent as a sketcher. Cole agreed. He had a number of followers, a few other informal pupils, but it is Church who is the most famous, the most important, really the fullest pupil that he took on. This is an important period in American art, and you're looking actually at two views of Cole, one a self-portrait there on the left, and a marvelously tender drawing that Church made during this period as a young man, having come into the tutelage, really the family of Thomas Cole. Cole, by this point, that is 1844, was well established in American art. He'd been painting actively, selling pictures, exhibiting since the 1820s, sells his first three important paintings in 1825 in New York. And, of course, travels back to Europe a couple of times, spends time familiarizing himself with not only his contemporary artists in England, but something of the Italian old masters. He visits the ruins, various parts of Italy. So a sophisticated artist who really absorbed much of the European tradition and brings it now to the United States. He was actually born in England, comes with his family as a very young man. So Cole goes through a period of really turning American attention most critically to nature and landscape painting. These become the great subjects of American art now through much of the rest of the 19th century, and largely because of Cole's initiative. Now, he was part of a generation, as we know, of, in a sense, the Romantic revival, the parallels to Géricault and Delacroix, of course, in France, to Turner and Constable in England, to Frederic in Germany. Cole is really part of the much wider Romantic movement in Western culture that is beginning to celebrate nature in the 19th century, especially as industry in these civilized countries is beginning to intrude into nature. And this was no more true than it was here. Only in America, we wanted to preserve the idea of raw wilderness. We wanted to believe that the American identity was nature. I think it was Perry Miller used the phrase, we were nature's nation. And of course, beginning with this wonderful coincidence of Cole's first sale of 3 landscape paintings with the opening of the Erie Canal, which really was the turning point for first opening up, New York, but really opening up the East Coast to the interior of the continent and setting in motion both travel for families that wanted to move into the interior and ultimately across the entire continent, but also for goods. Goods could move back and forth. It turns really New York into New York City, that is, into the great port city of the East Coast. Up until that point, really, one could argue that Boston and or Philadelphia were the cultural capitals of the country. So Cole's arrival as a young man, a teenager, I think in 1818, comes to this country, couldn't have been at a more important moment. And he seizes this opportunity to develop landscape painting and, in effect, create an American idiom out of it. That's one important sort of significance of Cole, the timing of Cole's career. We know, as you probably do, that not only is he our first great landscape painter, and really landscape, you see, is now replacing history painting as the most important subject matter for artists, certainly on these shores. On the continent, in Europe, and well into the 19th century, the hierarchy of subject matter still called for giving the most homage to history painting, mythology, religious subjects were all at the top of the list. Cole, in a sense, upends that hierarchy where landscape, portraiture, genre painting were all on the lower part of what an artist would do to be significant or gain a great international reputation. And it's the great achievement of Cole that, as I say, he takes a landscape painting and elevates it really to the top of the ladder. We also know, of course, that Cole continued to paint history paintings, in effect quasi-religious pictures, both from the Bible, but of course the great imaginary cycles of the Course of Empire and Voyage of Life. So that foundation, all I guess I'm saying is that foundation in European art and in English art never leaves Cole. It's part of the balance of his particular year and his particular career. And I'm stressing that because Church will take on that mantle after Cole's death, but increasingly give attention just to nature. Or put it another way, Church will absorb the ideas of contemporary history into his landscape painting, into the formulas of painting nature itself. And that transformation, that is to say, in these late 1840s, when these two come together, is the turning point for a new generation of art, that is to say, Church's generation. And so where Cole is literally, we now believe, the key artist who defines American art, who represents American art for the second quarter of the 19th century, round numbers, that is to say 1825 up until his early death in 1848. Church has come to emerge now in the last, 4 or 5 decades as the most important American artist, I believe certainly, of the third quarter of the 19th century, from call it 1850 for Cole's death until the mid-1870s, when, as I said a moment ago, the style of landscape painting goes out of favor. It's replaced with the much more down-to-earth sense of mortality, the realism of Homer and Aikens. But Church's story is even more amazing than that, at least to all of us art historians in the field, which is to say, Church was utterly unknown when I started out as an art historian, and to my contemporaries, including David Huntington. And as those of us who were at Harvard at the time began to stake out American artists for our subjects against all currents of what was thought to be serious and respectable, I was told not to do a dissertation in American art, that I really should do something like Dutch art, and then I could do American art out of my back pocket. That was the view towards, a kind of colonial view still, that it had no serious fundamental literature. Church was likewise in that category of an American artist, and after their careers, some died, Lane died in 1865. Church really turns his attention to the architecture of Olana and its landscape. But even so, the paintings that he was doing largely went out of favor. Certainly the style did. It was seen by the later 19th century as heroic and even sentimental, as almost shrill in its exaggeration. Its sort of loud, celebratory quality of the American landscape. And in an age of industrialization, an age obviously of the Civil War and the continued tensions through Reconstruction, the kind of romantic celebration of twilight and sunset simply seemed out of sync with the later generations of the 19th century. And so Church, too, goes into virtually complete obscurity, more so than any of the other artists we had worked on. By the 1950s, that began to change, interestingly, and I think partly it was the post-World War II era of American chauvinism and a rise to a new imperial power, gave us a consciousness of our nationality, and therefore looking again to the past. So in a curious way, abstract expressionism and its triumph was one of the precipitators, I think, of this new interest in our cultural history. And It is David Huntington, who was then studying at Yale, also didn't teach courses in American art. George Hamilton agreed to supervise his thesis on this unknown artist, but Hamilton, being a 19th century specialist, was interested to know what Huntington could do on Church. And of all of these artists, Church went literally from a nobody. I mean, there were a few of his major pictures in American museums. The Corcoran had Niagara Falls. The Met had the Andes of Ecuador. But that was largely it. The sketches were not known, certainly not the drawings. Olana was soon to be in danger of being sold, and it was thought to be, just a curious kind of archive. That was really the view. And thanks to Huntington's efforts, both saving Olana, but also doing the first big public exhibition and book on Church, it really turns Church's career and reputation around, as I say, for being a nobody artist to, as I've said, to the most important artist of his generation. Just an amazing turnaround in aesthetic reputation. And it's partly because Huntington persuaded us that Church is a great technician, an extraordinary draftsman, and painter. And, as I say, was in turn able to take Cole's legacy and make it relevant to the mid-century years in the 19th century. I'll just pause one more moment to call your attention to the little drawing on the right, and it is a little drawing. It's in our exhibition because it is so tender. There's clearly a refinement here that the young Church brings to his draftsmanship. It's one of the most finished drawings for a tiny little piece. And of course you can see Church titles it, T. Cole at the bottom. He actually titles it and then of course signs it in his own block letters as well. He thought of this obviously in that sense as a finished work, as something serious. And in that intimacy, that sense of seriousness, I think we feel something of really the relationship that clearly had developed between Cole and Church. We don't know the exact date of the drawing in this 2-year period, presumably near the end of it when they knew each other well, when Church had now really mastered Cole's style, learned, and was in effect on the threshold of surpassing his teacher. Hence the phrasing we've used of master, mentoring, an emerging master. But it's a daring portrait in the sense that not only is it a good likeness, but the casualness, the way he's shown us Cole with his hand, his cheek, chin resting on his hand, pushing up the tuft of hair, that's sort of now out of place in a totally intimate and casual kind of rendition. Moreover, the head tilted forward, so you see the balding head. And even more amazing to me, we're looking at his eyelids. That's the subject of a corpse. And yet, what we realize, of course, is that Cole is seen, Church is rendering him, looking down, presumably at a book, maybe at a sketch that he's got on the table in front of him. He is thinking. It's amazing the sense of psychology in this little drawing. And giving us a sense of a living figure. In sum, to me, it's an image of enormous affection that suggests, as I say, this symbiotic relationship that had developed. Church comes into the family literally as a teenager after Wadsworth's recommendation. And becomes a kind of older brother, a stepbrother to the Cole children, who were younger and often needed babysitting when Cole himself was off painting, and a kind of friend, member of the family. All of that, it seems to me, is wrapped up in this wonderful image. So that's what we began to explore. And I just want to run through a number of illustrations that make some of these comparisons. There are a number of pictures that Church does, one being there on the right, these so-called apotheoses to Thomas Cole, a late Cole there on the left, the cross in the wilderness. It's in the Louvre. We were unable to bring it, but it does show you, obviously, that the first point to be made, obviously, not surprisingly, as a student, so to speak, the Church would take up Cole's subject matter, these quasi or overt religious subjects like the cross in the wilderness. They begin to part ways later on. Church really was a religious artist. I think it was Louis Noble, his biographer, who said that in his later years, he prayed before he began to paint. And so for him, there was this real sense of a divinity in nature. Church also had faith and believed in the spiritual in nature, but clearly was much more interested eventually in the landscape itself. Here, using the idea, and of course, the apotheosis to Cole shows you, I don't want to trip here, shows you the cross in a field of flowers. This was painted as Church's tribute to Thomas Cole after Cole's death in 1848, and Church paints those flowers, suggesting not only is Cole at rest, so as it were, but has begun to take new life in nature itself. And there are a whole series of these small pictures. We've got a couple of variations in the little exhibition of these crosses in the wilderness. It's interesting that a couple of them are titled Apotheosis to Thomas Cole, but are dated 1847. There's much argument, were they done during Cole's lifetime? I tend to think not. Doesn't make sense. I think he would have done an apotheosis after the figure, the subject, had died. So to me, they are post 1847. Here another example, an obvious kind of comparison. Church arrived while Cole was painting his series, The Voyage of Life, and I show you manhood with the mature figure on the rapids of time, nature threatening there in the background, the blasted trunks. There was the turbulence of maturity before the fourth and final stage of old age. And on the right, of course, another Church sort of redoing of a Cole subject with a cross there in the sky, and there are other variations. Thomas Cole took his young pupil, Church, obviously, out into the Catskill landscape. Number of pilgrimages to the Catskill Mountain House, to Catskill Falls, and so forth. Here you have, at least on the left, to my mind, and it looks much better in the original, very beautiful, oil sketch. It's really more than a sketch. It's I would call a finished oil study for, I believe, the final painting in the New York Historical Society, looking out over the Catskills from the studio, which you can still see today at sunset. And it's a very finished picture, quite unusual for Thomas Cole. And there on the right, a typical, again, biblical scene by Church with his great interest, of course, in landscape and the effects of twilight there in the far distance. This is a case where I think towards the end of this period, that is, say, about 1846, Cole's style is beginning to tighten up. It's beginning to be interested in some of the clarities that we associate with Church. And so one of the interesting things to consider as you look through the exhibition are the ways in which I believe, as Church developed, he was actually beginning to influence his master. That's part of the premise of this exhibition, the exchange between the two. It wasn't all a one-way street. Their modes of painting are finely different. I mean, that's one of the pleasures of these comparisons, is to see not only where the continuities, the indebtedness, the revisiting of subject matter by the younger artist of the older, but also the ways in which they remain singular and different, belonging to different generations. Cole's style, for example, tended to be more generalized, his brushwork more uniform. Church's brushwork begins, not to break down, that's the wrong word, but begins to be differentiated. He differentiates different aspects of nature for rocks, for trees, for water, for sky. And as you look closely at originals, you can begin to see that. Here again, just these repeated subjects by Cole on the left, and the kind of subject matter, the handling of landscape that we associate with Church, a twilight done at Mount Desert on the Maine coast, which leads me to a sort of second major subject matter that I've always been interested in, a reminder that the summer that Church arrives in Catskill to work with Cole, later that summer, Cole picks up, he leaves Church at home with Mrs. Cole and the children, and Church is told to babysit. Cole says also go out and sketch, continue your study of nature. And Cole himself gets on a buckboard with his artist friend from Boston, Henry Cheever Pratt, and they ride through the White Mountains, through northern New England, New Hampshire, Vermont, northern Maine, and come down to the far Maine coast to Mount Desert from the north. Almost everyone literally everybody up until that point, artists primarily, visited the Maine coast by steamer. The first steamers by chartered boat. So Cole's adventure was really quite dramatic. He kept a sketchbook, which for me turned out to be serendipitous, because it was the first thing that I discovered in the Princeton Art Museum collection, was Cole's sketchbook from these particular years that had been acquired in the 1930s. And in it were something like a dozen to 15 drawings by Cole of the Mount Desert landscape, which then led Cole on his return to begin painting over the next year or so. At least we know of 3 important oils, one of which is in the exhibition from Albany, that is to say Otter Cliffs at Mount Desert. Another is in Cleveland. The third is in the Fogg Museum at Harvard. And I'm just enumerating this because, as I say, Cole makes this trip that very summer that Church arrives. So I've tried to, one has to try and imagine the experience, what it must have been like when Cole returned to Catskill at the end of the summer with this book filled with sketches and begins now to turn his attention to these, in effect, exotic Maine subjects. The excitement that it must have had for the young Church, a whole new kind of American, raw wilderness. One of the issues during this whole period, of course, was the intrusions, in a way, of man into nature, of civilization into nature. The coming of the railroads up the Hudson, or to the American interior, the settlements in the wilderness, the population of America moving into the middle of the continent, and then with the discovery of gold, happens right at the juncture between Cole and Church, 1849. The sense of still trying to find the pure wilderness experience. Cole did that in that summer of 1844, and as I say, how it must have stimulated the young Frederic Church. Well, we have a pretty good idea because a few years later, 2 years, in fact, after Cole's death in 1848, the summer of 1850. Church goes to Mount Desert himself, And from Church's paintings, he painted feverishly that summer of 1850 on Mount Desert, sketched hundreds of drawings in pen, pencil, gouache, Chinese white. Partly it looks, as you go through the inventory of those drawings, as if one of the primary reasons for going was to follow in his now deceased mentor's footsteps, because he repeats many of the same subjects, handles them differently. So, as I say, this period turns out to be so critical in a variety of ways. In fact, the sketch, as I say, you see here on the right, is indebted to Cole, and it is a church at Mount Desert. And almost all of the Mount Desert paintings that follow, likewise, even though Cole has died several years before, the legacy of Cole, the impact of painting sunrise and sunset, become the great subject matter now that the church takes up throughout the 1850s. Here again, one of those Catskill views by Cole, and of course Church on the right-hand screen. I call your attention to something that, of course, is a continuity, but also a shift that reveals a little bit of the differences between these two artists. In this case, compositionally. Cole still paints in what might be called the conventions of European, particularly English landscape painting. That is to say, the framing of a view across a pond, lake, or river, down a valley, framed on either side by trees reaching up, as you see here. Cole certainly worked from nature, made his studies, his sketches, and worked them up. But in the studio, he didn't hesitate to adjust compositions, because the purpose of a studio picture was to, in a sense, turn the raw fragments of nature into a work of art. And therefore, adjustments in design, relationships among the parts had to be, as it were, perfected. Now, it's a kind of arbitrary comparison. This is a late view of Mount Desert, probably in the mid-50s by Church, when he has become fascinated, as I say, with sunset. Well, this is part, in a sense, of what Church is now going to introduce in this second phase of American art, that is, say, or the third quarter of the 19th century, what we've come to call luminism, the fascination, even the obsession with sky itself. And Church's compositions now tend to open up. There are no elements often at the framing edges. Moreover, there's less and less attention to what's going on in the foreground. Cole often would have figures on horseback or, walking through the woods, talking, whatever. And so there's a kind of narrative content up front. Church's compositions tend to overlook the foreground. They want to draw the eye into the middle ground and, of course, into the distance. And as you can see in the Church painting, I'm just using this as one example to make my point. Really, the upper two-thirds of that Church composition is all sky, all meteorology. And I use that word because another distinction is a reminder that the natural sciences were beginning to evolve in the mid-19th century into separate disciplines, where overall it had been a kind of general cosmology. Now there are scientists, and there is science history that is developing the new fields of geology, of meteorology, of botany, the various substances of nature itself. And Church really is representing that interest now in the specifics of nature, the specific experience and effects of time of day. And we'll see this in a moment, even from the way they approach drawing. So in this comparison, you see one of a number that gives you an idea, as I say, of how close they were, but how Church was beginning, in his way, to move beyond Cole. There are comparisons of this. We don't know the circumstances of why Church painted his copy of the Oxbow there on the right. It's a case where this is such a direct, I won't say copy, but such a direct variation that I'm not quite certain what the circumstances were, why Church undertook it, except, as I say, to follow the example, follow through on trying the various examples of Cole's painting, either recently completed or in the studio at the time that he visited. You see it in other comparisons, like, for example, a very late Cole from this period, The Picnic Party, now in Brooklyn, from the late 1840s, when Church certainly would have seen it. And Church, as you can see on the right-hand screen, reuses the basic formula for one of his early, quote, history paintings. This is the Hooker Party, coming from Massachusetts to found the state of Connecticut, kind of imaginary historical picture of a couple of centuries before. But what does Church do? But as you can see, he uses the same composition with large groupings of trees here on the left half of the canvas. On the right side, opens it up, reflections on water, little figures in the foreground. This is Church still very much in the Thomas Cole sort of mode. And so, as I say, one moves back and forth, and what's so fascinating, you can't quite pin down what's going on here, except to see this kind of constant interchange as I say, informing their work. Now, when Church does get to Mount Desert, and here is Cole's painting on the left of so-called Otter Cliffs on the what is now the ocean side, the southern ocean side of Mount Desert Island, part of, if you've been there, Acadia National Park. This was right on the edge of the Park Loop Road. It was all preserved by the Rockefellers beginning at the turn of the 20th century. But I mentioned earlier, something of Cole's distortions, and this is an area I know well. I've sailed by it constantly. Otter Cliffs is a dramatic rise of cliff face from the water shoreline used for rock climbing. But if you saw a photograph of it, you would know that this was an absolute vertical cliff. And Cole has, you may just be able to make out, go look at the real thing, has tilted that cliff forward, as it were, to make it more dramatic, more threatening. You probably can't make out, but really at the top here, there's a little speck standing of a human figure, sort of ant size. And a human figure standing there today would in fact be much larger, proportionate to the cliffs. So it's another device Cole uses, as I say, to suggest the awesomeness of nature. Not only the vastness, its threatening quality, the sense of violence and noise, sound, and so forth, as the waves dash upon the shore. Even more amazing, actually, is there is no way you can look. We are basically looking in an easterly direction. You cannot sail or boat around this area and actually see the profile of the landscape this way. The curious thing is you can see it coming from the other side. The profile of Otter Cliffs is absolutely visible against the sky and water coming in the other direction. And so Cole has taken the absolute liberty of shifting that, of showing us, in a way, an imaginary profile against the water, against the horizontal of the landscape on the right, that in actuality is impossible to see. Church I don't think would have gone that far, and on the right is a Church drawing, which gives you a hint, of course, of what he's going to do in nature. In Church's drawing there, you really have a sense of the particular kinds of quartz, the particular kind of granite that was a part of the the Ice Age deposit of rock along the Maine coast. That is a study of somebody who has approached nature not as a romantic, but in a way the artist as scientist. This cubic sense of the pink rocks of Mount Desert, Church captures even in a study. And so the sentiment, and of course this is done now in 1850, so it's 6 years later or more than Cole's painting, but it shows, as I say, a new kind of approach that will emerge in Church's art. Both artists kept extensive drawings. Church much more prolific, but here again is an interesting comparison. Church's drawing for the Cincinnati painting here on the left, Cole's drawing for the Cincinnati painting, showing us the Porcupine Islands east of Bar Harbor, marvelous sailing area, very precisely done. Clearly Church wanted to go to that, if not that exact spot along the coast, but also sketch that side of Mount Desert, and does so, as you can see, in the drawing on the right-hand screen. Actually, Church's drawing is not from that vantage point, it's from the north looking along that, but it's the same coastal area, Frenchman's Bay. Church's drawing, however, again, if you saw it specifically, has a kind of particularity, a precision in draftsmanship. The Cole drawing actually is as geographically correct as Cole ever gets, but Church is even more direct, less willing to, as I say, manipulate in his rendering. Here is the Cole painting of Frenchman's Day in Cincinnati on the left. And excuse me, again, it's filled with, again, a whole variety of distortions. That is to say, we're standing on the southern shore. Otter Cliffs is just over here that we just looked at, looking out at the two Porcupine Islands we just saw in the drawing on the left-hand screen. Again, the slides don't give you the detail, but on the rock in the foreground is a human figure, looking out at this awesome landscape. Again, this is going to be a painting about man's smallness in the presence of God's nature and all of the drama of God's nature. Moreover, up here on the top of the rocks is a big American eagle. Now, eagles had begun to fly over this terrain, but of course Cole introduces it, I believe, as a symbolic presence. This is a national landscape, he is saying. This is an American landscape with an American eagle. Not only that, Cole might well have been aware of Charles Wilson Peele's great painting, The Artist in His Museum, that has the dead American eagle. No, it's the dead turkey in the foreground, the American eagle on an upper shelf. The whole debate about what would be the national bird, the turkey versus the eagle. The eagle, of course, becomes the national bird. And, of course, Audubon had just been through this area himself, painting the American eagle. So, in a sense, Cole is, I believe, aware of what was of larger interest in American culture at this time. He wants to turn this from a still recognizable view, but into something standing for a much bigger definition of America. And to do that, as you can see, we're looking out at open water here, which is possible if you stand on these rocks and you look out to the south. But in fact, we're looking across here, and this is looking due east, and here we're looking to the north. So Cole has in fact conflated or telescoped an actual view, an actual optical view of 180 degrees into a compact canvas. As I say, it's still recognizable. We know what the subject is, But once you realize what he's done with it, how he's transformed it, this tells you, as I say, I believe, about Cole's interest in a more symbolic, a more philosophical landscape. We have a variation of the one on the right, a little oil study that Church did from the exact same rocks, looking down on the surf. But as you look closely at these marvelous little studies, and these were academy boards about no bigger than 15 inches wide that Church took, under his arm. It was said that he would finish them in a day's time. To me, they're just miracles of painting created in a very short period of time, but not hastily. If you look into the water surf itself, there is a shifting of brushstroke with each passage of water, where the water dashes up, it's thicker and foamier. Where it's beginning to recede over the sand or the pink granite, it becomes thinner. It takes on a different kind of comma-like structure. In other words, Church is actually observing, like a scientist, is actually observing what I want to call the molecular structure, the physics of how water operates, whereas Thomas Cole's water is water. We read it as water, but it's the same kind of brushstroke used for here, or for his clouds. And in Church paintings, both these oil studies and in the finished works, you can begin to see that differentiation of actual technical execution. And as I say, we have a pairing in the exhibition of two pictures, Cole and Church, one above the other, where in fact you can explore and see in an instant both what was inherited and what was dispensed with. It's a marvelous sort of teaching instruction. Ditto, Cole on the left, Catskill Falls, Church on the right, also painting a number of waterfalls, both in the Catskill area, but of course soon in South America. And again, it's hard to see in these details this differentiation of rock structure. Church fascinated and able to carry off. The whole idea of painting mist. Church loved to paint, for example, passages of fog. Just think of the demand, technically, of painting sort of vapor, painting moisture. That's a hint, as I say, of Church, as it were, the meteorologist, of wanting to observe that kind of refinement. Or the tour de force, I think, to me, of this foreground of the water running at rapids over the rapids and the rocks in the foreground. Those are some of the most beautiful passages in Church's paintings, with, as I say, a kind of precision that you just simply don't see for the most part in Cole's painting. We see this, I've mentioned they were both wonderful draftsmen, but their whole approaches really are different, even in the famous tree trunks. And the blasted tree trunk is one of the great sort of iconic images of Hudson River School painting. For many of these artists, it was all about the passage of time, that in the blasted tree trunk, you have the history, as it were, of God's presence in nature. A storm had come through, lightning had blasted and killed a tree trunk, which had in turn fallen over, and then often you see among the dead roots, new green leaves and shoots rising up, as if to remind us that God is still present in nature, that nature regenerates just as every day succeeds the day before it. So too do these elements of nature go on in endless cycles of regeneration. And something of these exaggerated, contorted gesturing of Cole's tree trunks there on the left are partly to give us that sense of nature as drama. This is what I mean, taking over the burden, taking over the mission of history painting in a humble tree trunk. Yes, there's something of that in Church's trees, but in Church's painting and in his drawings, instead of what I would refer to as just simply trees, you begin in Church's paintings to identify, same thing with Durand, with anybody in this later generation, the difference between a birch tree and a beech tree, certainly different kinds of pine trees. In other words, the interest in specificity, the interest in species itself. And so something of that, even though it's a dead tree trunk there, on the right by Church, there's something of it as being a living organism, of being something that Church absolutely stumbled upon and wanted to capture in all of its individuality. So here again, something inherited, but something transformed. Moreover, the inscriptions on the two artists' drawings are often very telling in their difference. Here's one, for example, in Detroit, where I think you can clearly read at the bottom, Cole titles it with a general term, tranquility. The trees are at rest. There's the Catskills in the background, probably where the mountain house was, a view that Cole certainly knew. But Cole turns even his drawing into, as it were, the emotion, the state of mind, tranquility. Whereas when Church makes notations on his drawings, as we'll see in a moment, they will end up with the kind of, as I say, specificity in the natural landscape that you see in that oil study. The white birches there, unmistakable in the foreground. So while these careers overlap and merge and there's a dialogue between them, there's this declaration of independence by Church as he comes out of this tutorial, becomes an independent artist over the next few years. I think the best way of demonstrating, again, Cole on the left, Church on the right, side by side, the two subjects, a world of difference. Dead trees, we've all seen blowdowns in nature. Hurricanes come through, swamps fill up, and trees die. But these tree trunks of Cole's on the left, as I say, remain generalized. He is interested in this process of juxtaposing the dead and the living. It's all about this kind of philosophizing about the cycles of nature. But look at Church's painting on the right, an early Church. This was done still in the 1840s. I think it's the year after Cole died, but clearly under Cole's influence. Same kind of subject matter. But, and there's an important but here, that is to say, Church's storm is still taking place before our very eyes, before our feet, as we see the turbulence of moisture and those the passing thunderclouds there in the background. That the blast itself in Church's painting that has brought down the upper part of the limb. There's a kind of rawness to this as the light has caught it, so that we almost feel that this has been struck by lightning moments before we got there, maybe even while we were there. In other words, there's something, as I say, of a kind of immediacy, a sense of time now, of time specific. So to project this further, there'll be an eventual difference in the two artists treating sunrise and sunset. For Cole, it is the philosophical sense that as sun sets, it's the fulfillment of day's cycle, and therefore the belief that the next day will repeat that same cycle. Church, yes, will be interested in twilight, but will be interested in a particular moment. There are drawings of his, for example, of moon rising, where he'll note moon rising light 30 seconds after moonrise. 30 seconds. So Church, as I say, is interested in these nuances of the immediate, of the presently observed, whereas Cole is willing, as I say, to move beyond the immediate to something more general. And whether you look at trees, or in this case, a pairing of rocks, I think even more, you can see that this big, great boulder, sure, Cole must have seen it, but he turns it into a kind of Kleenex boulder. You don't know, you have a clue as to what kind of stone it is, what kind of rock. Whereas with Church's rock studies, here one on the right, he actually, I don't know whether in this drawing or not, no, he titles and dates it, but there are many of his drawings where he'll identify a particular kind of pink granite. Or talk about the tide being a half hour out. This fascination with geology that comes from an awareness of the new sciences. And, for example, Church's contemporary William Stanley Hazeltine had studied at Harvard with Louis Agassiz. And so there was a direct connection of these artists to the language of the new language of the natural sciences. Oh, here's a case in point where, again, you have a landscape, two rocky landscape drawings, coals, rocks, generally blocking out light and shadow. But Church's study there on the right has a whole list of notations at the top with numbers referring to specific colors in the rocks themselves. Some of these, I say, identify a time of day. On this one, I think there's a notation, as I say, about the tide being out half an hour. There's that kind of specificity. So over and over again, you can make these comparisons, really begin to see the different personalities emerge. Again, landscape views, I'm just repeating myself now, a Cole study on his Maine trip. Here, no, I'm sorry, this is a Hudson River view, a church painting, again with elaborate notations about moonrise, about light and shadow. And so while there is this, Church is clearly following the instructions of his teacher, but already in this period you begin to find, as I say, the emergence of the artist coming out of it. I don't have a color image of the Harvard painting, but here is the third Mount Desert picture done by Cole on that summer of 1844 trip called House in Mount Desert. One of the things I learned in working on this exhibition and this group of pictures, and on the right you have, I've forgotten, is this Cole or Church? This is Church. No, it's Cole. Is it not? What is it? Where are you? They're both Cole. What I'm interested in here is the sequencing of these cabins, or as it were, or some Cole. This is one of the ones that Cole did at the end of the 1840s before he died, called Home is the Hunter, or The Hunter's Return. One's in Amon Carter. But beginning with the Harvard painting, interestingly, you have the crudest of cabins. In the next sequence of pictures, only a year or so later, after all, he's doing the kind of thing you see there on the right, where we've now got a fairly elaborately built domestic cabin. The family is beginning to appear in the foreground. It's beginning to be a quasi-settled landscape. And as it happened then, Church would take up this subject matter. Cole himself, there's another one or two of these images in the exhibition. One of the last in the series, Cole turns his cabin almost into a federal-style house in a very cultivated farm area. So it's just another reminder of the gradual but inevitable transformation of nature itself into something, quote, civilized. And a critic used in a way, the ambiguous phrase of the worry these artists had for, quote, the acts of civilization. So another way of, again, what's so fascinating about this 2-year period is that it's right at the heart of this transitional period of what had first been the romance of science, the romance of the railroad, for example, but soon realizing within a few years that the railroad was cutting into nature, was creating pollution, that man's settlement was taking over the raw wilderness. And these two artists document in subjects like the cabin in the wilderness, that transformation. Finally, a comparison of Cole's old mill at sunset with a drawing. I just didn't happen to have the image, the slide of the painting, but the drawing gives you a pretty good idea. Church's drawing of lumber mill at Mount Desert, of the differences. Church's is a literal, real lumber mill that he saw and documented. Cole's, from its very title, Old Mill at Sunset. Yes, it's a mill that Cole probably saw, but he turns it into, as I say, something romantic, something in which the composition, of course, in a way becomes almost more important. That is to say, you have the dense, raw nature there on the left, a nature that was not long ago inhabited by Native Americans, and then a more cultivated treescape on the right-hand side, framing the waterway in the middle, and this oval format, which ties it all together. So this, too, compositionally, was a perfect balancing between raw nature and settled nature. That was Cole's story. Church, by contrast, as I say, wants to give us the real mill that he saw before his eyes, and without any embellishment. And finally, a reminder, of course, that, as I said, Cole's influence continues in Church's work, not only powerful in the late 1840s, the last 2 years of Cole's life after Church had set off on his own, set up his own studio, begun to explore this area for the first time on his own before Cole's death. And then, as I say, that interest in Cole's pilgrimages accelerates during the 1850s. But this is a perfect way of wrapping the discussion up. That is to say, on the left, of course, is Cole's painting of one of the many versions he did of Mount Etna from Taormina in the, I think, early 1840s, mid-career, on one of his, probably his second trip back to Europe, to the Old World, to identifying with the classical tradition of Western art. But while it is about a volcano, and you can see that Church is painting one of his first of Cotopaxi in the 1850s, this is mid-1850s, same volcano in a way, that Church clearly is, in his mind, whether now intentionally or not, is clearly remembering the Mount Etna pictures by Cole. But Cole's painting is ultimately, of course, about the past, the ruined past. Yes, it was Cole who helped us identify American art that triumphed over the ravages of Europe. Europe was all dead and covered with ruins. But it is interesting that Cole could not give up painting the volcano there in a ravaged landscape, so that we have the fallen columns in the foreground. We have Cole, as it were, looking to the past. Church's painting, by contrast, using a Cole composition, now more luminous, more aware of that thin blue light of the Andes. In the foreground gives us a very Colean-like farmstead with green fields and a farm, a productive farm there in the left foreground. Right out of the language of Cole, but something, as I say, that really is about the present. And for that matter, it's one of Church's triumphant images of the end of an era, in the sense, not only Cole's era, but a turning point in his art. Because, of course, when I said this is mid-1850s, America is beginning to undergo now crisis. And that by the mid-50s has reached almost a no turning point, and the rush to civil war occurs in the next 5 years. And I'm not showing the image, but I will tell you that 6 years later, in 1862, Church will return to Mount Cotopaxi, but he will now paint it exploding. It's a great painting in Detroit of Cotopaxi exploding, not with plumes of white steam that suggests the world's energy coming up, in the midst of tranquility. This great last moment, heroic moment in 19th century America, where, in a sense, we still had a continental America, a unified America. It might have, the tensions were beneath the surface. Church's painting summarizes all of that. And when he returns to it, that world itself has changed. Darwin has overturned the laws of nature. The Civil War has overturned the nature of the country itself. Everything seems to be in chaos and exploding. That's what I mean when I started by saying these two artists, in a sense, spoke to American history through landscape painting, first about the past, then about the present, and in a way about the future. Thank you very much.